Entire science department. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of Whitmore University's historic Alumni Center as Dr. Margaret Parker pointed her manicured finger directly at my chest, her voice carrying across the crowded gala with surgical precision. "You're nothing but a common thief, Kate Miller, and everyone here knows it." What she didn't know, as she stood there in her designer gown surrounded by the university's most distinguished faculty members, was that the woman she was publicly humiliating had quietly written the checks that funded every piece of equipment in her precious research lab, every graduate student stipend, and every breakthrough her family claimed as their own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of the Founders Gala had started like any other Saturday in our Cambridge brownstone, with me carefully pressing James's dress shirt while he showered, making sure every detail of his appearance would meet his family's impossibly high standards. After 6 years of marriage to Dr. James Parker, I'd perfected the art of being the invisible support system behind his rising career in biomedical research. While the November wind rattled the windows of our modest faculty housing, I laid out his bow tie and cufflinks with the same methodical precision I'd once used to review pharmaceutical acquisition proposals, though James had no idea about that part of my past. As far as my husband and his distinguished academic family knew, I was simply Kate Miller Parker, the fortunate recipient of a substantial family inheritance who spent her days volunteering at the university's community outreach programs and organizing Faculty Wives charity events. They saw me as James's devoted spouse who provided the financial stability his research career needed while he pursued groundbreaking work in gene therapy for cancer treatment. What they couldn't see was the woman who had inherited Miller Pharmaceuticals at 22 and had spent the last decade quietly transforming it into one of the most influential medical research funding organizations in the country. James emerged from the bathroom, adjusting his watch with the focused intensity he brought to everything, from calibrating lab equipment to planning our weekend activities. At 34, he maintained the lean build and sharp intellect that had first attracted me at a medical conference 8 years ago, back when I was still openly Dr. Catherine Miller, recent PhD in biochemistry, and newly minted pharmaceutical heiress, trying to figure out how to honor my grandfather's legacy while building something meaningful of my own. "The Parker family table is right next to the dean's this year," James said, checking his reflection one final time. Mother specifically requested the seating arrangement so she could discuss the new cancer research wing with Dr. Harrison personally. This gala could determine the future funding structure for the entire biomedical department. I nodded supportively while internally calculating exactly how much of that future funding would actually come from the Miller Foundation, the anonymous charitable organization I'd established 5 years ago specifically to support cutting-edge medical research at institutions like Whitmore. Through carefully structured donations and grants, my foundation had quietly become the largest single contributor to the university's science programs, though no one except my attorney and the university president knew the foundation's true origins. The irony wasn't lost on me that James would spend the evening networking for research funds while sitting next to the very woman who'd already ensured his lab's financial security for the next decade. But maintaining that secret had become second nature after years of watching how differently people treated me when they knew about my wealth versus when they saw me as just another faculty wife with family money. James straightened his bow tie and turned to face me with the practiced smile that made him so effective at faculty meetings and grant presentations. "You look beautiful," he said, taking in my navy blue dress and pearl necklace. The compliment felt automatic, delivered with the same tone he used when reviewing his research notes, and I found myself wondering when our interactions had become so professionally courteous rather than genuinely intimate. "Dr. Margaret Parker specifically asked me to remind you about proper protocol tonight," James continued, his voice taking on the slightly formal cadence he adopted whenever discussing his mother's expectations. "As the department chair, she'll be representing Whitmore to some very important potential donors, and she wants to ensure everything reflects well on the Parker family's reputation in the research community." Dr. Margaret Parker had been the bane of my existence since the day James first brought me home to meet his family. A brilliant cardiovascular researcher who'd built her career through sheer determination and political acuity, she'd never quite approved of her son's choice to marry someone outside the academic establishment. Despite my PhD and my obvious financial contributions to James's career, She persisted in treating me like an academic outsider who'd somehow tripped her way into their prestigious family circle. The drive to the Alumni Center took us through Cambridge's historic streets, past the coffee shops and bookstores that gave the area its distinctive intellectual atmosphere. James navigated his sedan through the early evening traffic while fielding calls from his research team about a critical experiment running over the weekend. I watched the familiar landmarks pass by, each one carrying memories of the empire I'd built in secret while pretending to be nothing more than a supportive spouse. There was the corner building where I'd first met with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Whitmore's president, to discuss anonymous funding opportunities that could support innovative research without the bureaucratic constraints that often hindered academic progress. The law office where I'd spent countless hours with Marcus Thompson, my attorney, structuring charitable donations that would maximize impact while maintaining absolute anonymity. The bank where I'd sat across from investment advisors, managing the portfolio that generated enough income to fund multiple university departments while living off what appeared to be simple inheritance dividends. James knew none of this. When we'd met at that medical conference in Chicago, I'd been deliberately vague about my background, explaining that I came from pharmaceutical money and preferred to focus on supporting medical research rather than pursuing my own academic career. It had been easier that way, allowing me to gauge his interest in me as a person rather than as a financial opportunity. What I hadn't anticipated was how completely he and his family would embrace the fiction, that I was simply a wealthy but academically irrelevant spouse, whose primary value lay in providing financial stability and social connections. Over the years, that fiction had become increasingly suffocating, but I'd convinced myself it was protecting our relationship from the complications that might arise if James knew his wife was actually his professional superior in terms of both academic credentials and financial influence. Richard and Victoria will be presenting their latest research findings tonight, James mentioned as we pulled into the Alumni Center's circular drive. They've made some remarkable progress on the protein synthesis project, and Dr. Harrison is very interested in expanding their lab's capabilities. Richard Parker, James's older brother by 2 years, served as a senior researcher in the same biomedical department where James worked. Brilliant and ambitious like all the Parker siblings, Richard had married Dr. Victoria Parker, a lab supervisor whose strategic mind had helped advance several important research projects over the past few years. Together they formed a formidable academic power couple whose work was regularly featured in prestigious medical journals. What James didn't know, and what I'd carefully avoided mentioning, was that Richard and Victoria's protein synthesis project was funded almost entirely by a Miller Foundation grant I'd personally approved 6 months ago. Their remarkable progress was built on equipment I'd purchased, research assistants I'd funded, and laboratory space I'd helped renovate through anonymous donations channeled through the university's development office. The valet approached James's side of the car, and I watched my husband's demeanor shift into what I privately thought of as his academic networking persona. Confident handshake, engaging smile, the kind of intellectual charm that made people want to collaborate with him on important projects. As the valet handed him the parking ticket, James slipped the young man a $20 bill, with the casual generosity of someone who believed his financial security came from his wife's family trust, rather than his wife's business empire. Dr. Elena Rodriguez greeted us personally as we entered the Alumni Center's grand foyer, her warm smile and professional demeanor masking the complex relationship we developed over the past 5 years. Elena was one of only 3 people who knew the true source of the Miller Foundation's funding, and we'd established careful protocols for maintaining my anonymity during public events. Dr. and Mrs. Parker, Elena said, extending her hand to James first before turning to me with the respectful but not overly familiar tone we'd practiced for occasions like this. Welcome to this year's Founders Gala. We're honored to have such dedicated supporters of Whitmore's research mission in attendance tonight. James beamed under the attention, clearly pleased that the university president had personally acknowledged our presence. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. Kate and I are always excited to support the university's important work, especially the biomedical research that's changing lives around the world. As Elena spoke about the evening's program and the recognition ceremony planned for major donors, I caught the subtle signals that only I would recognize. The way she positioned herself to include me in her direct line of sight, the discreet nod she gave to her assistant standing near the registration table, the security detail near the main entrance who acknowledged my presence with an almost imperceptible gesture. My staff was maintaining the carefully constructed illusion that I was simply another faculty spouse, while simultaneously ensuring my actual security and comfort as one of the university's most significant benefactors. The contradiction felt both amusing and exhausting, a reminder of how completely I'd compartmentalized my public and private identities. The grand ballroom had been transformed for the evening into an elegant showcase of Whitmore's academic excellence, with displays highlighting recent research breakthroughs positioned throughout the space and roundtables arranged to facilitate networking among the university's most influential supporters. James guided me through the cocktail reception with practiced ease, introducing me to colleagues and donors as his wife while positioning himself to make important professional connections. Kate volunteers extensively with our community outreach programs, James would explain when people asked about my involvement with the university. She has a wonderful way of connecting with people and understanding what the community needs from our research initiatives. The description was accurate as far as it went, but it frustrated me how completely it diminished my actual contributions. The community outreach programs James mentioned were ones I'd designed and funded, drawing on my pharmaceutical background to identify research priorities that would have the greatest impact on public health. The connections I'd made weren't just social networking, they were strategic relationships that helped direct. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Funding toward the most promising scientific opportunities. Dr. Margaret Parker held court near the silent auction displays, surrounded by a circle of admirers that included several department heads and prominent donors. At 62, she remained an imposing figure whose silver hair and designer dress projected both academic authority and social sophistication. Her research on cardiovascular disease had earned international recognition, and her administrative skills had transformed Whitmore's biomedical department into one of the most respected programs in the country. She also made no secret of her belief that I was an intellectual lightweight, who'd married into the Parker family for social advancement, rather than genuine academic passion. "Kate, dear," Dr. Parker said as James and I approached her group, her tone managing to sound both welcoming and dismissive simultaneously. "How lovely that you could join us tonight. I hope you've had a chance to review the auction items. There are some beautiful jewelry pieces that might interest you." The suggestion that I'd be primarily interested in jewelry rather than the research equipment and laboratory funding opportunities also being auctioned perfectly encapsulated Margaret Parker's perception of my priorities. She saw me as a well-meaning but fundamentally frivolous woman whose financial contributions came from inherited wealth rather than earned success. "Actually," I replied with the diplomatic smile I'd perfected over years of similar interactions, "I've been most interested in the items supporting graduate student research. The fellowship opportunities seem like they could make a real difference in developing the next generation of scientists." Dr. Parker's expression flickered with what might have been surprise before settling back into polite condescension. "How thoughtful of you to consider the educational aspects. Of course, the real advancement in medical research happens at the senior level, where experienced scientists can make breakthrough discoveries that change entire fields of study." James stepped smoothly into the conversation, shifting focus to his mother's recent research publications and away from what he clearly saw as a potential source of tension between his wife and his family. I appreciated his diplomatic instincts even as I found myself frustrated by his assumption that I needed protection from academic discussions rather than recognition as someone capable of contributing meaningfully to them. Richard and Victoria Parker joined our group as dinner was announced, both carrying themselves with the confident bearing of successful researchers who were accustomed to being the smartest people in any room. Richard shared his brother's sharp features and intellectual intensity, while Victoria's elegant blonde style and strategic mind had made her a formidable presence in the competitive world of academic research politics. "Kate," Victoria said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "I heard you've been asking questions about some of our recent research protocols. I hope you're not finding the technical aspects too overwhelming." The comment was delivered with such subtle condescension that anyone overhearing might have interpreted it as friendly concern rather than a calculated insult. Victoria had a gift for making remarks that sounded supportive, while actually undermining the target's credibility, a skill that had served her well in advancing through academic hierarchies where direct confrontation was considered unprofessional. What Victoria didn't know was that my questions about research protocols weren't the curiosity of an amateur trying to understand her husband's work. They were the inquiries of someone who held advanced degrees in biochemistry and pharmaceutical development, someone who'd spent years reviewing grant applications and research proposals, someone who could identify methodological flaws or innovative approaches with the expertise of a peer reviewer for major scientific journals. "I find the technical aspects fascinating," I replied carefully. "It's remarkable how much progress the department has made in protein synthesis research over the past year. The funding must have been quite substantial to support such advanced equipment and expanded laboratory space." Richard's chest puffed slightly with pride as he launched into an explanation of their research advances, describing breakthrough discoveries and innovative methodologies, with the enthusiasm of someone whose work was genuinely changing lives. What he didn't mention, because he didn't know, was that every piece of equipment he referenced had been purchased with Miller Foundation grants. Every laboratory upgrade had been funded by my anonymous donations, and every research assistant position he'd created was supported by endowments I'd established specifically to advance this type of groundbreaking work. As we moved into the dining room and found our assigned table, I realized that the evening would be a perfect microcosm of my entire marriage to James. I would sit quietly while his family discussed research I'd funded, listen politely while they explained scientific concepts I understood better than they realized, and smile supportively while they positioned themselves as the intellectual leaders in fields where I was actually a major behind-the-scenes power. The Parker family table had been strategically positioned near the front of the ballroom, close enough to the stage that Margaret could easily network with the evening's speakers and honored guests. Our tablemates included Dr. Harrison, the Dean of Sciences, along with several other department heads and their spouses. The conversation flowed easily among topics of research funding, recent scientific publications, and the political dynamics of academic advancement. James thrived in this environment, demonstrating the quick intellect and social skills that had made him successful in competitive academic circles. He could discuss complex research methodologies with Dr. Harrison, while simultaneously charming the dean's wife with humorous anecdotes about laboratory mishaps. Watching him work the table, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with him at that conference in Chicago, when his passion for medical research had seemed to offer the possibility of building something meaningful together. But as the evening progressed, I also noticed how completely he and his family had relegated me to the role of decorative spouse rather than intellectual equal. When the conversation turned to gene therapy innovations, James would summarize complex concepts for my benefit, as if I couldn't follow the technical discussion. When Dr. Harrison mentioned new funding opportunities, Margaret would change the subject to safer topics like university social events or community volunteer work. The most frustrating part was knowing that I could contribute more meaningfully to these discussions than anyone else at the table. My pharmaceutical background had given me insights into research commercialization that could benefit their academic work. My foundation's grant-making experience had taught me about funding strategies that could maximize research impact. My business connections could open doors to collaboration opportunities that would advance their scientific goals beyond anything they'd achieved independently. Yet I continued to smile and nod, asking the occasional polite question while internally calculating exactly how much of their research success was built on my hidden contributions. The protein synthesis project Richard kept describing had received $2.3 million in Miller Foundation support over the past 18 months. Victoria's laboratory upgrades had cost $850,000 in equipment purchases that I'd approved personally. James's gene therapy research was supported by a 5-year, $4.7 million grant that I'd designed specifically to advance the type of work he was passionate about pursuing. During the dinner service, Dr. Rodriguez took the stage to welcome guests and introduce the evening's recognition ceremony. She spoke eloquently about Whitmore's commitment to advancing human knowledge through scientific research, about the partnership between academic excellence and philanthropic support that made breakthrough discoveries possible. Tonight, we're particularly honored to recognize the generosity of supporters whose contributions have transformed our research capabilities, Elena announced, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. The Miller Foundation's ongoing commitment to biomedical research has enabled discoveries that are literally saving lives around the world. I felt James's hand find mine under the table as Elena continued describing the Foundation's impact, his gesture reflecting the pride he felt in what he perceived as his university's achievement rather than recognition of my personal involvement. The Foundation's work was consistently described in terms that emphasized its anonymous nature, protecting my privacy while acknowledging the scope of its contributions to scientific advancement. What Elena couldn't say, but what I knew she understood, was that the Miller Foundation's support had positioned Whitmore's biomedical department as one of the most innovative and well-funded research programs in the country. Our anonymous grants had attracted top researchers, enabled cutting-edge equipment purchases, and supported graduate student training that was producing the next generation of medical scientists. As the recognition ceremony continued, highlighting various donors and their contributions to university programs, I found myself reflecting on the complex balance I'd maintained between public anonymity and private influence. For 5 years, I'd watched from the sidelines as others received credit for advances that my funding had made possible, telling myself that the impact mattered more than the recognition. But sitting at that table, listening to James's family discuss research success that was built on my financial support, while treating me like an intellectual outsider, I began to question whether my commitment to anonymity was protecting anything worth preserving. The woman who'd inherited a pharmaceutical fortune and transformed it into a research funding empire was hiding behind a facade that grew more restrictive every year. The evening's guest speaker was Dr. Amanda Chen, a renowned cancer researcher whose work on immunotherapy had earned international acclaim. As she took the stage to discuss the future of medical research and the importance of sustained funding for innovative projects, I realized that her laboratory had also received Miller Foundation support. Though, like most grant recipients, she had no idea of the Foundation's true origins. Dr. Chen's presentation was brilliant, outlining breakthrough discoveries that were moving from laboratory research into clinical trials that could save thousands of lives. She spoke about the collaborative nature of modern scientific research, emphasizing how advances in one laboratory often built on discoveries from multiple institutions and funding sources. The work we do as individual researchers is only possible because of the larger ecosystem of support that sustains scientific inquiry, Dr. Chen explained, her passion for her subject evident in every word. Anonymous benefactors and private foundations provide the stability that allows us to pursue high-risk, high-reward research that might not qualify for traditional government funding. James leaned closer to me during the applause that followed Dr. Chen's remarks. "This is exactly the kind of work I hope to be doing in 5 years," he whispered, his excitement genuine and infectious. "Imagine being able to contribute to research that could cure cancer or treat genetic diseases that have been considered hopeless." I squeezed his hand, sharing his enthusiasm while simultaneously knowing that his current research was already contributing to exactly those goals through the Miller Foundation grants that supported his laboratory. The gene therapy work he was pursuing had potential applications for treating inherited diseases, and the preliminary results were promising enough that I'd approved expanded funding for the next phase of his research. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. My husband was dreaming of achieving scientific impact that he was already accomplishing with my support, but neither of us could acknowledge that connection without destroying the carefully constructed fiction that had defined our relationship for 6 years. As dessert was served and the formal program concluded, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted to a more relaxed networking environment. Faculty members and donors mingled freely, discussing research collaborations and funding opportunities over coffee and cognac. James excused himself to speak with Dr. Harrison about a potential collaboration between his laboratory and researchers at Harvard Medical School, leaving me temporarily alone at our table. Dr. Rodriguez approached during this lull in conversation, her timing suggesting this was a planned opportunity for private discussion rather than casual social interaction. Elena had become skilled at finding moments to communicate with me during public events without drawing attention to our relationship as foundation donor and university recipient. "Mrs. Parker," she said formally, settling into the chair James had vacated. "I hope you're enjoying this evening's celebration of our research achievements. The biomedical department's success over the past few years has been truly remarkable." Elena's carefully neutral tone carried layers of meaning that only I could fully appreciate. She was acknowledging the Miller Foundation's role in that success while maintaining the public fiction that I was simply another faculty spouse attending a university social event. "It's wonderful to see such important work being recognized," I replied, matching her diplomatic tone while our eyes communicated the deeper conversation we couldn't have openly. The research being conducted here has implications far beyond the university community. Indeed, Elena nodded, her expression suggesting she had something specific she wanted to discuss. I've been meaning to mention that we've received an interesting inquiry about potential collaboration between our biomedical research and a pharmaceutical development company. The opportunity could provide substantial funding for clinical trial development, but it would require careful coordination with our existing research grants to avoid any conflicts of interest. The comment was Elena's way of asking whether the Miller Foundation would support expanded pharmaceutical collaboration, though she couldn't ask directly without revealing our relationship to anyone who might be listening. Over the years, we'd developed this kind of coded communication that allowed us to discuss foundation business during public events without compromising my anonymity. Collaboration between academic research and pharmaceutical development seems like a natural partnership, I responded carefully. As long as the academic integrity of the research is maintained, such arrangements could benefit everyone involved. Elena smiled with genuine warmth, understanding that I was giving preliminary approval for exploring the pharmaceutical partnership while emphasizing the importance of maintaining research independence. These conversations required careful navigation, but they allowed the Miller Foundation to remain responsive to emerging opportunities while protecting my privacy. James returned to our table as Elena was concluding our discussion, his expression animated with excitement about his conversation with Dr. Harrison. The potential Harvard collaboration he'd been exploring would involve sharing research data and coordinating clinical trials that could accelerate breakthrough discoveries in gene therapy applications. Dr. Harrison thinks there might be foundation grants available to support the collaboration, James explained enthusiastically. Apparently, there are anonymous donors who specifically fund innovative research partnerships between institutions. It could be exactly the opportunity we need to take our work to the next level. I managed to maintain an appropriately supportive expression, while internally calculating whether the Miller Foundation's budget could accommodate expanded grants for Harvard collaboration. The research James was describing aligned perfectly with our funding priorities, and supporting institutional partnerships had always been one of my strategic goals for advancing medical research. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, I said, meaning every word, even though I couldn't explain that I was probably the anonymous donor he was hoping would support his research. I hope the funding works out. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, James and I made our rounds, saying goodbye to faculty colleagues and thanking Dr. Rodriguez for hosting such an inspiring event. The Parker family gathered near the coat check, discussing the evening's presentations and networking opportunities with the satisfied air of people who'd accomplished their social and professional objectives. It was a very successful evening, Margaret declared, adjusting her evening wrap with practiced elegance. Dr. Harrison seemed particularly interested in the cardiovascular research applications of our protein synthesis work. I suspect we'll be seeing increased funding opportunities in the coming year. Richard and Victoria nodded in agreement, both clearly pleased with the connections they'd made and the interest their research had generated among potential collaborators and funding sources. They discussed strategy for following up on promising conversations, planning meetings that could turn evening networking into concrete research support. James contributed to the family planning session with suggestions about coordinating their various research projects to maximize funding potential and avoid redundant applications to the same grant sources. His strategic thinking impressed me, though I found myself wondering what he might accomplish if he knew that the largest potential funding source was already committed to supporting his work through my foundation. As we waited for the valet to retrieve James's car, I reflected on the evening's complex emotional landscape. I'd spent 4 hours surrounded by people discussing research I'd funded, listening to plans I could facilitate, and watching my husband dream of achieving goals that my support had already made possible. The disconnect between my hidden influence and public invisibility had never felt more pronounced. The drive home through Cambridge's quiet streets gave me time to process the evening's events and the growing sense that my commitment to anonymity was becoming unsustainable. For 5 years, I'd convinced myself that hiding my identity protected my relationship with James and allowed me to support research objectively without the complications that might arise from personal recognition. But watching James and his family treat me as an intellectual outsider while unknowingly depending on my financial support for their research success, I began to question whether my anonymity was actually protecting anything worth preserving. The woman who'd built a pharmaceutical fortune into a research funding empire was suffocating behind a facade that grew more restrictive every year. As we pulled into our driveway, James reached across the car to take my hand with the affectionate gesture that had once made my heart race but now felt routine and obligatory. "Thank you for being such a wonderful partner tonight," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth despite the formal tone. "I know these academic events aren't always the most exciting for you, but your presence means everything to me." I smiled and squeezed his hand, appreciating the sentiment while feeling a deep sadness about how completely he misunderstood my relationship to the work that defined his life. James saw me as a supportive spouse who tolerated his academic career, rather than as someone who was actively advancing the field he was passionate about. What I didn't know, as I fell asleep that night in our Cambridge brownstone, was that the forces I'd set in motion through years of anonymous funding were about to collide in ways that would shatter every carefully constructed fiction I'd built around my identity. The research success I'd enabled was attracting attention that would soon expose secrets I'd spent years protecting, and the family that had dismissed me as an intellectual lightweight was about to discover exactly who they'd been underestimating. The woman who'd hidden her true capabilities for 6 years was about to face a choice between continuing to live behind a diminishing facade or finally revealing the empire she'd built in the shadows of academia. And that choice would change everything. The following Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only November in Cambridge could provide, and I woke to find James already dressed in his laboratory attire, checking his tablet with the focused intensity he brought to reviewing experimental data. Through our bedroom windows, the Charles River reflected the early sunlight like hammered silver, and I could hear the distant sounds of students making their way across campus for morning classes. "The protein synthesis results came in over the weekend," James said without looking up from his screen. "Richard and Victoria's team achieved a breakthrough that could revolutionize how we approach genetic disorders. Dr. Harrison wants to fast-track the research for publication in Nature." I sat up in bed, reaching for the silk robe draped across the nearby chair while processing this information. The protein synthesis project James was describing had been one of my most carefully monitored Miller Foundation investments, with quarterly progress reports crossing my desk through Marcus Thompson's law firm. The breakthrough he mentioned should have been documented in reports I'd already reviewed, yet I had no memory of seeing such significant results. "That's wonderful news," I replied, though something nagged at me about the timing. "When exactly did the results come in?" James finally looked up from his tablet, his expression carrying the excited energy that always accompanied major research developments. "Victoria called Richard around midnight on Saturday. Apparently, the final test sequences completed while we were at the gala, and the data analysis confirmed their hypothesis beyond what anyone expected. The timeline troubled me for reasons I couldn't immediately articulate. The Miller Foundation maintained strict oversight protocols for all major grants, requiring researchers to submit preliminary data before announcing significant discoveries. Victoria's team should have reported their breakthrough to the Foundation's review board before celebrating with family members or planning publications. I should get to the lab early," James continued, gathering his materials with the efficient movements of someone eager to begin an important day. "Dr. Harrison wants to review the complete data set before deciding how to proceed with publication and funding requests for the next phase." After James left for the university, I settled into my home office with coffee and my secure laptop, accessing the Miller Foundation's grant management system through encrypted connections that protected both my identity and our research partners' confidential information. The protein synthesis project file contained regular progress reports dating back 18 months, but the most recent entry was from 3 weeks ago, with no mention of imminent breakthroughs or completed test sequences. According to the Foundation's records, Richard and Victoria's team was still several months away from the critical experiments that would determine whether their theoretical approach could produce practical applications. The research timeline showed careful progression through preliminary phases, with major testing scheduled for early spring following additional safety protocols and methodology refinements. Yet James had described results suggesting the team had somehow accelerated their research by months while achieving outcomes that exceeded their original projections. The discrepancy between the Foundation's documented timeline and the Parker family's celebration of breakthrough discoveries demanded investigation. I called Marcus Thompson's law office, reaching his private line that bypassed normal receptionist screening. Marcus had served as my confidential attorney for 7 years, handling everything from Foundation legal structure to the complex trust arrangements that maintained my anonymity while ensuring proper oversight of charitable activities. "Kate," Marcus answered immediately, his voice carrying the alertness of someone accustomed to handling sensitive matters at any hour. "I was just reviewing the quarterly reports from Whitmore. Is this about the Parker family projects?" "Actually, yes," I replied, explaining the discrepancy between James's description of breakthrough results and the Foundation's documented research timeline. Either our oversight protocols failed to capture a major acceleration in their work, or something else is happening that we need to understand. Marcus was quiet for several moments, and I could hear him accessing computer files in the background. As my attorney and the Foundation's legal counsel, he maintained parallel documentation systems that tracked both grant compliance and potential issues that might require intervention. "Kate, I think you need to see something," Marcus said finally. "I've been monitoring some unusual activity related to the Parker family grants, but I wanted to gather more information before raising concerns. Can you meet me at the downtown office this afternoon?" The tone of his voice suggested this wasn't a routine compliance review or administrative clarification. Marcus Thompson had built his legal practice around discretion and careful analysis, avoiding unnecessary alarm while ensuring his clients had complete information for making important decisions. If he was requesting an immediate meeting, the situation warranted serious attention. I spent the morning reviewing all Miller Foundation grants connected to Whitmore University's biomedical department, searching for patterns or inconsistencies that might explain the gap between documented research progress and the Parker family's reported breakthroughs. The Foundation had invested over $12 million in various projects over the past 3 years, supporting everything from graduate student fellowships to major equipment purchases. The scope of our investment in Whitmore's research made any compliance issues particularly significant, both for the Foundation's mission and for my personal situation as someone secretly married into the primary beneficiary family. If research funds were being misused or if grant requirements were being ignored, the consequences could affect not only the Foundation's other charitable activities, but also my relationship with James and his family. Marcus Thompson's law office occupied the top floor of a Back Bay building that offered panoramic views of Boston's skyline and harbor. The space reflected both professional success and personal discretion, with elegant furnishings that suggested prosperity without ostentation and meeting rooms designed to ensure absolute privacy for sensitive discussions. Marcus met me personally at the elevator, his expression serious but controlled in the way that had made him invaluable for handling complex family business matters. At 58, he maintained the sharp intellect and diplomatic skills that had built his practice around serving clients who required both legal expertise and absolute confidentiality. "Before we discuss the Whitmore situation," Marcus began as we settled into his private conference room, "I want you to know that everything we've discovered falls within legal boundaries. No laws have been broken, but there are ethical considerations that affect both the Foundation and your personal circumstances." He opened a thick folder containing financial documents, correspondence, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs taken with telephoto lenses. The material was organized with the methodical precision that characterized all of Marcus's work, but the content suggested investigations that went far beyond routine grant oversight. 3 weeks ago, our quarterly audit of Whitmore grants identified some irregularities in expense reporting from Richard and Victoria Parker's laboratory, Marcus explained, spreading financial statements across the conference table. The discrepancies were subtle, but they suggested equipment purchases that didn't match the research timeline documented in their grant applications. I studied the financial records, noting equipment acquisitions that would only be necessary for research phases that weren't scheduled to begin for several months. The purchases weren't violations of grant terms exactly, but they indicated either poor planning or deliberate acceleration of research without Foundation approval. "We initiated a more detailed review," Marcus continued, "which revealed a pattern of coordination between the Parker family research projects that wasn't disclosed in their original grant applications. Richard and Victoria have been sharing resources, data, and personnel across multiple foundation grants in ways that may constitute conflicts of interest. The implications began to crystallize as I reviewed the documentation. If the Parker family was coordinating their research efforts without proper disclosure, they could be using foundation funds more efficiently than intended, while potentially compromising the independent review processes that ensured scientific integrity. "There's more," Marcus said, producing a second folder that contained what appeared to be correspondence between university personnel and external organizations. Dr. Margaret Parker has been in communication with pharmaceutical companies about licensing opportunities for research discoveries that were funded by Miller Foundation grants. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized the scope of what Marcus was revealing. If Margaret Parker was negotiating commercial licensing for foundation-funded research without proper disclosure, she could be violating both grant terms and university policies, while potentially profiting from my charitable investments. The licensing discussions involve several major pharmaceutical companies, Marcus continued, including Meridian Pharmaceuticals, which has been particularly aggressive in trying to acquire academic research for commercial development. Dr. Parker has positioned herself as the primary contact for negotiating terms that would give Meridian exclusive access to certain research discoveries. Meridian Pharmaceuticals was a company I knew well from my background in the industry, with a reputation for acquiring promising research from academic institutions and then limiting public access through restrictive licensing and pricing strategies. If Margaret Parker was negotiating with Meridian without foundation oversight, she could be undermining the very mission that my charitable giving was intended to support. "What about James's research?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Is he involved in these licensing discussions?" Marcus hesitated before responding, his expression suggesting he understood the personal implications of what he was about to reveal. "James appears to be unaware of the broader coordination between family research projects, but his gene therapy work is included in the portfolio that Dr. Parker has been discussing with Meridian." The revelation hit me like ice water. My husband's research, which I'd specifically funded because of its potential for advancing public health, was being packaged with other family projects for potential sale to a pharmaceutical company known for restricting access to life-saving treatments. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I need to understand exactly what's happening and how long this has been going on." Over the next hour, Marcus laid out a complex pattern of coordination, communication, and potential conflicts of interest that painted the Parker family's research activities in an entirely different light than the independent scientific work I'd believed I was supporting. The protein synthesis breakthrough that James had celebrated was real, but it had been achieved by combining resources and data from multiple foundation grants in ways that weren't disclosed to the foundation's review board. Richard and Victoria's team had accelerated their research by using preliminary data from James's gene therapy project and equipment purchased through Margaret's cardiovascular research grants. While the scientific collaboration might have produced excellent results, the lack of disclosure meant the foundation couldn't properly evaluate whether the research was meeting its intended goals or whether the coordination was creating conflicts that compromised scientific independence. More troubling was the evidence of Margaret Parker's communications with Meridian Pharmaceuticals, which suggested she'd been positioning her family's research portfolio for commercial licensing from the beginning, potentially using foundation grants to develop intellectual property that would ultimately benefit a private corporation rather than public health. Dr. Parker has been very careful to stay within legal boundaries, Marcus explained, but the pattern suggests a coordinated effort to maximize commercial value from foundation-funded research, while minimizing foundation oversight of how the grants are being used. I studied the surveillance photographs that showed Margaret Parker meeting with Meridian representatives at expensive restaurants throughout Boston, her body language suggesting comfortable familiarity rather than preliminary negotiations. If these meetings had been ongoing for months, the licensing discussions were far more advanced than anyone at the foundation realized. "What are our options?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would require difficult choices about both foundation policy and my personal relationships. "Legally, we can demand complete disclosure of all research coordination and commercial discussions," Marcus replied. "The foundation's grant terms give us the right to review any activities that might affect the public benefit mission of funded research." "And personally?" I asked, knowing that demanding such disclosure would inevitably reveal my identity as the Foundation's primary benefactor. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting the careful consideration he brought to complex personal and professional dilemmas. Kate, you've maintained your anonymity for 5 years by trusting that grant recipients would honor both the spirit and letter of Foundation agreements. The Parker family's activities suggest that trust may have been misplaced. The afternoon light streaming through the conference room windows cast long shadows across the documents spread before us, and I found myself thinking about the evening at the gala when I'd sat quietly while the Parker family discussed research success that was built on my funding. Their confidence in their achievements now seemed less like scientific pride and more like calculated performance designed to maintain access to resources they were using for purposes I'd never intended to support. "There's something else you need to know," Marcus said, producing a final folder that contained what appeared to be internal university correspondence. "Dr. Rodriguez has been asking questions about the Miller Foundation's oversight procedures. I believe she's beginning to suspect that the Parker family grants may not be operating according to standard protocols." Dr. Elena Rodriguez was one of only 3 people who knew my identity as the Foundation's benefactor, and her questions about oversight procedures suggested she'd noticed the same irregularities that had prompted Marcus's investigation. If Elena was concerned about grant compliance, the situation was serious enough to threaten both the Foundation's reputation and my personal anonymity. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I suspected Elena's concerns were probably well-founded given what Marcus had uncovered. "She's been requesting detailed documentation of grant approval processes and asking about the Foundation's procedures for monitoring research coordination between multiple grant recipients," Marcus explained. "Dr. Rodriguez understands the importance of maintaining your anonymity, but she also has responsibilities to the university that may require addressing compliance issues." The complexity of the situation was becoming clear. Elena Rodriguez needed to ensure that Whitmore University's research activities met both institutional standards and Foundation requirements, but addressing the Parker family's coordination and commercial discussions might require revealing details that could compromise my anonymity. Meanwhile, the Parker family appeared to be operating under the assumption that their research activities were beyond scrutiny because of their family connection to the Foundation's anonymous benefactor. They had no idea that their coordination was being monitored, or that their commercial discussions were documented by the very person they assumed would never discover their activities. "Marcus," I said finally, "I need a complete analysis of all Parker family activities that may have violated Foundation grant terms, and I need recommendations for addressing the situation while protecting the Foundation's mission." "And your anonymity?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already understood that maintaining my secret identity might no longer be possible. I looked out at Boston's skyline, thinking about the empire I'd built through careful planning and strategic anonymity, and the personal relationships I'd maintained by hiding my true identity and capabilities. For 5 years, I'd convinced myself that anonymity protected both my charitable work and my marriage from complications that might arise if people knew the full scope of my influence. But the Parker family's willingness to exploit what they saw as my ignorance, while potentially undermining the Foundation's mission, suggested that my anonymity had become a liability rather than an asset. The woman who'd funded breakthrough research while pretending to be an uninformed faculty wife was discovering that her carefully constructed facade had enabled exactly the kind of abuse she'd hoped to prevent. "I think it's time for some people to learn exactly who they've been dealing with," I said quietly. Marcus nodded with the satisfied expression of someone who'd been waiting for his client to reach this conclusion. "I'll prepare a complete dossier of Parker family activities and Foundation compliance issues. How do you want to proceed with disclosure?" The question required careful consideration. Simply revealing the compliance violations to Dr. Rodriguez would address the Foundation's immediate concerns, but might not adequately protect future research from similar exploitation. Confronting the Parker family directly would reveal my identity, but could prevent them from continuing activities that violated both Foundation agreements and university policies. I want documentation that will allow the Foundation to address compliance issues while ensuring the Parker family understands the consequences of their coordination and commercial discussions, I decided. If they've been taking advantage of what they perceived as my ignorance, they need to learn that their assumptions were incorrect. Over the next several hours, Marcus and I developed a strategy for addressing the Parker family's activities that would protect the Foundation's mission, while forcing accountability for their undisclosed coordination and commercial negotiations. The approach would require revealing my identity as the Foundation's benefactor, ending 5 years of carefully maintained anonymity. But as I reviewed the evidence of how the Parker family had exploited their access to Foundation resources, while treating me as an intellectual lightweight unworthy of inclusion in research discussions, I realized that my anonymity had been protecting people who didn't deserve protection, while preventing me from ensuring that my charitable investments achieved their intended goals. The woman who'd hidden her success for her husband's comfort was about to discover that her husband's family had been systematically undermining the very work she'd funded to support his career. The Foundation benefactor who'd trusted grant recipients to honor both the spirit and letter of charitable agreements was learning that trust without oversight enabled exactly the kind of exploitation she'd established the Foundation to prevent. As evening approached and Marcus finalized the documentation that would support Foundation action against the Parker family's compliance violations, I made a decision that would change everything. The gala where I'd sat quietly while being dismissed as an uninformed faculty wife would not be the last time I pretended to be less than I was. The next time the Parker family gathered to discuss research success built on my funding, they would discover exactly who had been financing their achievements and what consequences awaited those who violated the trust of someone they'd systematically underestimated. The woman who'd spent 6 years hiding her empire was about to step into the light, and the family that had dismissed her as intellectually insignificant was about to learn that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. The Foundation that had operated in secrecy would soon demand accountability from grant recipients who'd forgotten that charitable funds came with both opportunities and obligations. Tomorrow would bring conversations that would shatter the comfortable fiction that had defined my marriage and reveal the true cost of maintaining secrets that protected people who didn't deserve protection. The anonymous benefactor was about to become very visible, and the Parker family's research empire was about to discover that their Foundation relied on someone far more powerful than they'd ever imagined. The second annual Spring Research Symposium arrived with Cambridge's characteristic unpredictable weather, alternating between brilliant sunshine and threatening clouds that seemed to mirror my own emotional state as I prepared for what would become the most consequential evening of my academic marriage. 3 months had passed since Marcus Thompson and I had uncovered the full scope of the Parker family's coordination of Foundation-funded research, and tonight's event would serve as the perfect venue for revealing truths that had been hidden far too long. Unlike the autumn gala where I'd sat quietly while being dismissed as an intellectually insignificant faculty wife, tonight I would attend as Dr. Catherine Miller, invited guest speaker and newly public face of the Miller Foundation for Medical Research. The transformation from anonymous benefactor to visible Foundation leader had required months of careful planning, legal restructuring, and strategic communication with university leadership. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been instrumental in arranging my keynote presentation on philanthropic innovation in academic research, a topic that would allow me to discuss the Foundation's work while maintaining professional distance from the personal drama that was about to unfold. Elena understood that tonight's symposium would serve multiple purposes beyond celebrating research achievements. I stood before my bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue suit that projected both authority and accessibility, checking that every detail of my appearance conveyed the competence and sophistication that matched my actual professional credentials, rather than the decorative spouse persona I'd maintained for 6 years. The woman reflected in that mirror bore little resemblance to the person who'd once pressed James's shirts while hiding her PhD and pharmaceutical empire. James had left early for the university, claiming he needed to review presentation materials with Richard and Victoria before the evening's program began. What he didn't know was that their presentation on breakthrough protein synthesis research would be interrupted by revelations that would fundamentally alter their understanding of both research funding and family dynamics. The symposium venue was Whitmore's newly renovated Science Center, a gleaming facility that showcased the university's commitment to cutting-edge research while providing spaces elegant enough for major donor events. The building's architecture combined classical academic elements with modern technological features, creating an environment that honored both tradition and innovation. As I walked through the center's main entrance, several faculty members recognized me from my photograph in the Foundation's recent press releases announcing my transition to public leadership. The recognition felt strange after years of anonymity, but also liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in my academic marriage, I was being acknowledged for my actual accomplishments, rather than my relationship to James Parker. Dr. Rodriguez greeted me personally near the registration area, her expression reflecting both professional warmth and understanding of the evening's underlying tensions. As university president, Elena had to balance multiple competing interests, while ensuring that tonight's events strengthened rather than damaged Whitmore's research reputation. Dr. Miller, Elena said formally, extending her hand with the respect due to a major Foundation leader rather than a faculty spouse. Thank you for agreeing to participate in tonight's program. Your Foundation support has been transformative for our research capabilities. The formal introduction established my professional identity for anyone within hearing range, ensuring that tonight's audience would understand my presence as Foundation leadership rather than social attendance. Elena had carefully choreographed these opening moments to position me as the evening's most significant participant rather than James Parker's academically irrelevant wife. I'm honored to be here, I replied, matching Elena's professional tone while appreciating the subtle ways she was helping establish my credibility. The research being conducted at Whitmore represents exactly the kind of innovative work that the Miller Foundation was established to support. As we moved into the main auditorium, I noticed several Parker family members already present, reviewing notes and greeting colleagues with the confident bearing of researchers whose work would be prominently featured in tonight's presentations. Margaret Parker held court near the front of the auditorium, surrounded by department heads and graduate students who clearly viewed her as academic royalty. Richard and Victoria Parker were setting up their presentation materials on the main stage, their coordinated movements reflecting years of professional collaboration and personal partnership. James assisted with technical preparations, his expertise with laboratory equipment making him valuable support for his family's research demonstrations. None of them had noticed my arrival yet, their attention focused on ensuring their presentations would showcase their research achievements to maximum advantage. The irony of their preparation wasn't lost on me. They were polishing presentations about research success that had been built on my funding, while remaining completely unaware that the Foundation's benefactor was observing their activities from across the auditorium. Marcus Thompson arrived 15 minutes before the program began, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documentation supporting everything we'd discovered about Parker family research coordination and potential grant violations. As my attorney and the Foundation's legal counsel, Marcus would provide both professional support and legal protection if tonight's revelations prompted disputes about Foundation policies or research compliance. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked quietly as we took seats in the auditorium's VIP section reserved for major donors and distinguished guests. "I've been ready for months," I replied, though I could feel my heart rate accelerating as the reality of ending 6 years of anonymity became imminent. The only question is whether they'll maintain their fiction until the very end, or if they'll crack under pressure when they realize who they've been dealing with. The symposium opened with Elena Rodriguez welcoming guests and outlining the evening's program, which would feature presentations from Whitmore's most successful research teams, followed by my keynote address on philanthropic support for academic innovation. The format was designed to showcase research achievements before discussing the funding mechanisms that made such work possible. Margaret Parker took the stage first, presenting an overview of cardiovascular research advances that had positioned Whitmore's biomedical department among the most respected programs in the country. Her presentation was polished and authoritative, demonstrating both scientific expertise and administrative acumen that had built her reputation as one of academic medicine's most influential leaders. What Margaret didn't mention, because she didn't know, was that her cardiovascular research program had received over $3.2 million in Miller Foundation support over the past 4 years, funding that had enabled equipment purchases, personnel expansion, and clinical trials that formed the foundation of her research success. The breakthrough discoveries we've achieved in cardiovascular treatment represent collaboration between brilliant researchers and generous benefactors who understand the importance of supporting innovative science, Margaret concluded, her voice carrying across the auditorium with practiced authority. Anonymous donors and private foundations provide the stability that allows academic researchers to pursue high-risk, high-reward projects that traditional funding sources might not support. The applause that followed Margaret's presentation was enthusiastic and genuine, reflecting both respect for her research accomplishments and appreciation for her role in advancing Whitmore's academic reputation. James joined the applause with obvious pride in his mother's achievements, his expression reflecting the family loyalty that had always been one of his most admirable characteristics. Richard and Victoria Parker followed with their presentation on protein synthesis research, describing breakthrough discoveries that had accelerated their work by months while producing results that exceeded their original projections. Their scientific collaboration was impressive, demonstrating both individual expertise and coordinated teamwork that had maximized research impact. The protein synthesis applications we've developed have potential implications for treating genetic disorders that have been considered untreatable, Victoria explained, her presentation slides showing molecular structures and treatment pathways that represented genuine scientific advancement. The research timeline was accelerated through strategic coordination with related projects, allowing us to achieve critical breakthroughs ahead of our original schedule. The mention of strategic coordination made my pulse quicken, as this was the first public acknowledgement of the research integration that Marcus had documented in his investigation. Victoria's casual reference to coordination suggested she was either unaware that such integration required Foundation approval or confident that Foundation oversight was insufficient to detect undisclosed collaboration. James concluded the family presentations with an overview of gene therapy research that positioned his work as the foundation for future breakthroughs in treating inherited diseases. His presentation was passionate and articulate, demonstrating both scientific expertise and genuine commitment to advancing medical treatment for conditions that caused tremendous human suffering. The gene therapy applications we're developing represent the convergence of multiple research streams, James explained, gesturing toward slides that showed treatment protocols and clinical trial designs. The work builds on protein synthesis advances and cardiovascular research insights, creating integrated approaches that could revolutionize how we treat genetic disorders. As James described research integration that spanned all three Parker family projects, I realized that their coordination was even more extensive than Marcus had documented. They weren't just sharing resources and data between related grants. They were operating as a coordinated research enterprise that used Foundation funding to support integrated projects while reporting to the Foundation as if each grant was supporting independent research. The applause that followed James's presentation was prolonged and enthusiastic, with several audience members offering standing ovations for research that promised to transform medical treatment for thousands of patients. The scientific impact of their work was undeniable, even if their methods for achieving that impact raised serious questions about grant compliance and research integrity. Elena Rodriguez returned to the stage as the presentations concluded, her expression reflecting both pride in Whitmore's research achievements and anticipation of the evening's keynote address. As university president, Elena understood that tonight's symposium would establish new precedents for Foundation-university relationships, while potentially addressing compliance issues that had been developing for months. Our final presentation tonight comes from Dr. Catherine Miller, founder and director of the Miller Foundation for Medical Research, Elena announced, her introduction establishing my professional credentials rather than my personal relationships. Dr. Miller will discuss philanthropic innovation in academic research and the Foundation's vision for supporting breakthrough discoveries that advance human health. The introduction prompted scattered applause as audience members processed the information that the Miller Foundation's leadership was present at tonight's symposium. Most attendees knew the Foundation by reputation as one of medical research's most generous and selective benefactors, but few had expected to meet the Foundation's director at a university research event. I walked to the podium with measured confidence, carrying notes that would guide a presentation I'd rehearsed extensively while ensuring I could respond spontaneously to audience reactions. The auditorium fell silent as I adjusted the microphone and looked out at faces that included my husband, his family, and colleagues who'd known me for years as James Parker's academically insignificant wife. "Good evening," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's excellent acoustics. "I'm honored to be here tonight to discuss the Miller Foundation's commitment to supporting innovative medical research that advances human health and scientific understanding. I could see James in the front row, his expression showing polite interest rather than recognition, as he listened to a presentation from someone he assumed was a stranger. 6 years of marriage, and my husband was listening to his wife discuss her professional accomplishments without realizing her identity. The Miller Foundation was established with the conviction that breakthrough medical discoveries require sustained support from benefactors who understand both scientific innovation and research integrity. I continued, beginning to build toward revelations that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of foundation relationships. Over the past 5 years, the foundation has invested over $50 million in academic research projects, supporting everything from basic laboratory research to advanced clinical trials that bring life-saving treatments to patients who desperately need them. The magnitude of the foundation's investment prompted murmurs throughout the auditorium, as most audience members had underestimated the scope of private foundation support for academic research. Even university administrators were surprised by the scale of charitable funding that had supported their institutional mission. However, I continued, my tone becoming more serious. The foundation's success requires research partners who honor both the spirit and letter of grant agreements, maintaining the transparency and integrity that ensure charitable investments achieve their intended goals. Margaret Parker shifted uncomfortably in her seat, perhaps sensing that the presentation was moving beyond general discussion of philanthropic principles toward more specific concerns about research compliance. As department chair, she would be responsible for addressing any foundation concerns about grant administration or research coordination. Tonight, I want to discuss a case study that illustrates both the potential and the challenges of foundation support for academic research, I said, opening the portfolio Marcus had prepared with documentation of Parker family activities. This case involves a research family whose work has been supported by multiple foundation grants over several years. James leaned forward with interest, assuming he was about to hear about research that might be relevant to his own work. The irony of his attention wasn't lost on me. My husband was eagerly listening to a case study about his own family's research violations. The research family in question has achieved remarkable scientific advances, I continued, but their success has come at the cost of transparency and compliance with foundation requirements that protect both research integrity and charitable mission. Victoria Parker's expression showed the first signs of concern, her professional instincts perhaps recognizing that this presentation was moving beyond academic theory towards specific accusations. As someone involved in grant administration, Victoria would understand the implications of foundation concerns about research compliance. Specifically, I said, consulting the documentation Marcus had assembled, this research family has coordinated activities across multiple foundation grants without proper disclosure, shared resources and personnel in ways that violated grant terms, and engaged in commercial licensing discussions that compromised the public benefit mission of charitable funding. The auditorium fell completely silent as audience members realized they were listening to accusations of research misconduct rather than general discussion of philanthropic principles. Several faculty members glanced toward the Parker family, perhaps wondering if these generic accusations might have specific targets. The research coordination involved sharing data, equipment, and personnel across 3 separate foundation grants, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of publicly exposing my husband's family. The grants were awarded based on applications that described independent research projects, but the actual work involved integrated collaboration that should have been disclosed to foundation review boards. Margaret Parker stood abruptly, her expression showing both anger and professional concern about public accusations that could damage both personal and institutional reputations. "Excuse me," she interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling academic discussions. "These are serious accusations that require careful review rather than public presentation. If you have concerns about specific research activities, they should be addressed through proper university channels." "Dr. Parker," I replied calmly, "the Foundation has attempted to address these concerns through proper channels for several months. Tonight's presentation represents escalation that became necessary when internal review failed to produce adequate transparency." "What foundation?" Margaret demanded, her professional composure beginning to crack as she realized the presentation involved specific, rather than hypothetical concerns. Which research family are you discussing? I looked directly at Margaret Parker, then at Richard and Victoria, and finally at James, whose expression showed growing confusion as he began to suspect that tonight's presentation might involve people he knew personally. The Miller Foundation for Medical Research, I said clearly, and the research family consists of Dr. Margaret Parker, Dr. Richard Parker, Dr. Victoria Parker, and Dr. James Parker of Whitmore University's Biomedical Research Department. The gasps that followed my revelation were audible throughout the auditorium as audience members processed the information that a major foundation director was publicly accusing prominent faculty members of research misconduct. James stared at me with complete incomprehension, unable to reconcile the professional presentation with his assumptions about foundation leadership. Furthermore, I continued, the Miller Foundation has documented evidence that Dr. Margaret Parker has been negotiating commercial licensing agreements with Meridian Pharmaceuticals without foundation approval, potentially violating both grant terms and university policies regarding intellectual property developed with charitable funding. Margaret Parker's face cycled through several emotions as she struggled to understand how a foundation director could have such detailed knowledge of her private business discussions. Those negotiations are preliminary discussions that don't affect research integrity, she said defensively. The foundation has no authority over potential commercial applications of completed research. Actually, I replied, consulting Marcus's documentation, foundation grant terms specifically require disclosure of any commercial discussions involving research funded by charitable donations. The Miller Foundation maintains intellectual property oversight for all grants, specifically to ensure that publicly beneficial research isn't restricted through exclusive licensing agreements. Victoria Parker joined her mother-in-law standing in front of the auditorium, her expression showing both professional concern and personal indignation about public accusations that could damage her research reputation. "This is completely inappropriate," Victoria declared. "Academic presentations aren't the proper venue for airing disputed foundation policies." "You're absolutely right," I agreed, standing up from behind the podium and moving closer to the Parker family group. "Academic presentations aren't the proper venue for these discussions. The proper venue would have been foundation review meetings that should have occurred months ago when the coordination first began." "What coordination?" James called out, his voice reflecting genuine confusion about accusations he didn't understand. "Mother, Richard, Victoria, what is she talking about?" I looked at my husband, feeling a deep sadness about the innocence that had protected him from understanding his family's activities, while simultaneously enabling their misconduct. "James," I said gently, "your family has been coordinating their research projects using Miller Foundation grants without foundation approval. They've shared resources, personnel, and data across multiple grants while reporting to the foundation as if each project was independent research." "That's impossible," James replied immediately. "Foundation grants have strict oversight requirements that prevent exactly that kind of coordination. Any sharing between projects would have to be documented and approved." "Unless," I said quietly, "the grant recipients believed that foundation oversight was inadequate to detect undisclosed coordination. Or unless they assumed that the foundation's benefactor was too uninformed to understand research compliance requirements." Margaret Parker stepped closer to the podium, her expression showing dawning recognition that tonight's confrontation involved more than generic foundation concerns. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice carrying both authority and growing alarm. "What's your real connection to the Miller Foundation?" I looked around the auditorium at faces that included university administrators, faculty colleagues, and graduate students who'd known me for years as James Parker's decorative spouse. Elena Rodriguez nodded encouragingly from her position near the stage, understanding that the moment for complete revelation had arrived. "My name is Dr. Catherine Miller," I said clearly, "and I am the founder, primary benefactor, and director of the Miller Foundation for Medical Research. I inherited Miller Pharmaceuticals at 22 and transformed it into a medical research funding organization specifically to support the kind of innovative work being conducted at institutions like Whitmore University." The silence that followed my revelation was complete and profound, broken only by the sound of James Parker's chair hitting the floor as he stood up abruptly, his expression showing shock that bordered on disbelief. "That's impossible," James said, his voice barely audible in the silent auditorium. Kate doesn't have a PhD. She inherited family money and volunteers with community programs. She doesn't know anything about medical research or pharmaceutical companies. Actually, I replied, feeling the weight of 6 years of deception lifting from my shoulders. Dr. Catherine Miller graduated summa cum laude from Harvard with a PhD in biochemistry, inherited controlling interest in Miller Pharmaceuticals, and has spent the past decade building one of the most influential medical research funding organizations in the country. James stared at me with complete incomprehension, struggling to reconcile the woman he'd married with the professional credentials I was claiming. Kate, he said weakly, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. Margaret Parker's face had gone completely white as she realized the full implications of my revelation. For 3 years, she'd been dismissing her daughter-in-law as an intellectually insignificant faculty wife, while simultaneously receiving millions of dollars in research funding from that same woman's charitable foundation. Dr. Parker, I said, addressing Margaret directly, you've spent our entire family relationship treating me as an academic outsider who didn't deserve inclusion in research discussions. What you didn't know was that the woman you dismissed as intellectually irrelevant was actually funding the research you discussed. The Protein Synthesis Project, Richard said suddenly, his voice showing dawning understanding of the evening's revelations. The gene therapy research, the cardiovascular studies. You're saying you funded all of it? The Miller Foundation has invested $8.7 million in Parker family research over the past 4 years, I confirmed, consulting Marcus's documentation. Every piece of equipment in your laboratories, every graduate student stipend, every clinical trial you've conducted has been supported by foundation grants that you've administered without proper transparency or coordination approval. Victoria Parker looked around the auditorium with growing alarm as she realized that hundreds of colleagues and university administrators were witnessing public accusations that could destroy her research reputation. This is libel, she declared. You can't make public accusations about research misconduct without due process or legal representation. Marcus Thompson stood up from his seat in the VIP section, carrying his portfolio with legal documentation that supported every accusation I'd made about Parker family activities. Dr. Parker, Marcus said formally, I'm Marcus Thompson, legal counsel for the Miller Foundation. We have extensive documentation of research coordination and commercial discussions that violate foundation grant terms. This presentation represents formal notification of compliance violations that require immediate remediation. The presence of legal counsel confirmed that tonight's revelations involved more than academic disagreements about research policy. The Parker family was facing formal accusations from a major foundation, with legal representation that suggested potential civil or criminal consequences for grant violations. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward to address the auditorium full of shocked faculty members and confused graduate students, who'd witnessed what appeared to be the complete destruction of a prominent research family's academic reputation. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena announced, her voice carrying the authority of university leadership, tonight's presentation has raised serious concerns about research compliance that require immediate and thorough investigation. The symposium will conclude now, and the university will address these matters through appropriate administrative channels. As audience members began filing out of the auditorium, many casting curious glances toward the Parker family group that remained frozen near the stage, I realized that 6 years of carefully maintained deception had been shattered in less than 30 minutes. The woman who'd hidden her pharmaceutical empire while pretending to be an academically irrelevant faculty wife had revealed herself as one of medical research's most influential benefactors. The family that had dismissed her as intellectually insignificant while exploiting her charitable funding was about to discover exactly what consequences awaited grant recipients who violated the trust of someone they'd systematically underestimated. James remained standing beside his overturned chair, staring at me with an expression that combined shock, confusion, and growing understanding of how completely he'd misunderstood the woman he'd married. The revelation that his wife was actually his research benefactor would require a fundamental reevaluation of everything he thought he knew about our relationship and his professional success. The anonymous foundation leader had become very visible, and the Parker family's research empire was about to discover that their charitable funding came from someone far more powerful and far less forgiving than they'd ever imagined. The auditorium emptied slowly as faculty members and graduate students filed out in hushed conversations, their voices carrying fragments of disbelief about the evening's dramatic revelations. Within 20 minutes, only the core participants remained, the Parker family standing in stunned cluster near the overturned chair, Marcus Thompson organizing legal documents at a nearby table, Dr. Rodriguez conferring quietly with university administrators, and myself, finally free from the exhausting performance of pretending to be less than I was. James hadn't moved since my revelation, his body language frozen in the shock of discovering that his wife of 6 years was not only a fellow PhD, but the secret benefactor whose funding had supported his entire research career. The man who'd spent our marriage explaining scientific concepts to me as if I were an intelligent but ultimately frivolous socialite was struggling to reconcile that condescending behavior with the reality that I held both advanced biochemistry credentials and control over one of medical research's most influential funding organizations. Margaret Parker broke the silence first, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed in public view. "This is preposterous," she declared, though her tone lacked the authority that usually characterized her professional pronouncements. "Catherine Miller is James's wife, not some pharmaceutical heiress with a secret foundation. This entire presentation is an elaborate hoax designed to embarrass our family." Marcus Thompson looked up from his documentation with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with clients who refuse to accept uncomfortable realities. "Dr. Parker," he said formally, opening his portfolio to reveal corporate filings, university records, and financial statements that supported every claim I'd made about my background and foundation activities. "I have complete documentation of Dr. Miller's educational credentials, her inheritance of Miller Pharmaceuticals, and her establishment of the foundation that has funded your family's research for the past 4 years. Margaret approached Marcus's table with the determined stride of someone preparing to challenge evidence that threatened her understanding of fundamental relationships. As she reviewed the documents he offered, her expression shifted from skeptical dismissal to growing alarm. As official university letterhead, corporate filings, and foundation tax returns confirmed the impossible truth that her academically dismissed daughter-in-law was actually one of the most powerful figures in medical research funding. "This says Kate graduated summa cum laude from Harvard," Margaret said weakly, holding up transcripts that documented my doctoral studies in biochemistry. She published 6 papers in prestigious journals before she was 25. She served on grant review boards for the National Science Foundation. "Dr. Catherine Miller's academic credentials are impeccable," Marcus confirmed, producing additional documentation that traced my progression from doctoral research through pharmaceutical inheritance to foundation leadership. Her biochemistry expertise and business acumen made her uniquely qualified to identify promising research opportunities and provide strategic funding that maximizes scientific impact. Richard Parker moved closer to examine the financial records that detailed Miller Foundation grants to Whitmore University, his expression showing the dawning recognition that every research success his family had celebrated was built on funding from the woman they'd systematically excluded from intellectual discussions. $8.7 million, Richard said, his voice barely audible as he processed the scope of foundation investment in Parker family research. "Kate funded everything. The equipment, the personnel, the laboratory renovations, the clinical trials. Every breakthrough we achieved was supported by her money." Victoria Parker grabbed the financial statements from her husband's hands, scanning grant award letters and payment schedules with growing disbelief. "The protein synthesis project received $2.3 million over 18 months, she read aloud. "The cardiovascular research got $3.1 million for equipment and personnel. James's gene therapy work was supported by a 5-year, $4.7 million commitment." As Victoria recited the foundation's investment in their research, the true magnitude of their family's dependence on my funding became impossible to ignore. Every professional success they'd achieved, every research breakthrough they'd celebrated, every career advancement they'd earned, was built on charitable support from the woman they'd treated as an intellectual lightweight unworthy of inclusion in academic conversations. James finally moved, walking slowly toward the table where Marcus had spread documentation of my actual identity and professional accomplishments. His movements seemed mechanical, as if he were struggling to coordinate physical actions, while his mind processed revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about our relationship. "Kate," James said quietly, his voice carrying confusion and growing hurt, "why didn't you tell me? 6 years of marriage, and you let me think you were just someone with family money who didn't understand my work. I've been explaining basic scientific concepts to you like you were a curious amateur." I looked at my husband feeling a complex mixture of sadness, frustration, and liberation, as I prepared to answer the question that would define whether our marriage could survive the truth I'd hidden for so long. "James," I said gently, "I tried to tell you, especially in our early relationship. But every time I mentioned my academic background or research experience, you seemed more comfortable with the fiction that I was a wealthy but intellectually uncomplicated wife who supported your career without competing with it." "That's not true," James protested, though his tone lacked conviction. "I would have supported your academic interests. I would have encouraged you to pursue research if that's what you wanted." "Would you?" I asked, pulling out my phone to access recordings that Marcus had helped me compile over the past several months. "Because I have documentation of conversations where you dismissed my questions about research methodology as, quote, cute curiosity, and suggested I focus on social activities that were more suited to my background." I played a brief recording from 3 months earlier, capturing James's voice explaining protein synthesis to me in the condescending tone he used when he believed he was educating someone with limited scientific understanding. The recording revealed how completely he'd embraced the fiction that his wife needed his guidance to comprehend research concepts that I actually understood better than he did. James's face went pale as he heard his own voice treating me like an intelligent but ultimately amateur audience for his professional expertise. "I was trying to be helpful," he said weakly. "I thought you were interested in learning about my work." "I was interested in contributing to your work," I corrected. "I have expertise in pharmaceutical development and clinical trial design that could have advanced your research in ways you've never considered. But you were so invested in seeing me as a supportive audience rather than a professional colleague that you never asked about my actual qualifications." Margaret Parker interrupted our conversation with the sharp tone of someone whose professional reputation was facing imminent destruction. "Even if these documents are authentic," she said, gesturing toward Marcus's evidence, "that doesn't justify public accusations of research misconduct without due process or legal representation." "Actually," Dr. Rodriguez interjected, approaching our group with university administrators who'd remained to witness the evening's conclusions, "the Miller Foundation's concerns about research coordination and commercial licensing represent serious compliance issues that require immediate university investigation." Elena's tone carried the authority of institutional leadership combined with personal disappointment about activities that had apparently violated both foundation agreements and university policies. As president, she had responsibilities to multiple constituencies that included protecting Whitmore's academic reputation while ensuring that research activities met both legal and ethical standards. "Dr. Parker," Elena continued, addressing Margaret directly, "the university will need to review all correspondence between your family's research projects and external organizations, particularly any discussions about commercial licensing that weren't disclosed to the grants office." Margaret's expression showed growing alarm as she realized that university investigation would expose the full scope of her negotiations with Meridian Pharmaceuticals, discussions she'd conducted without proper disclosure to either the foundation or university administration. "Those were preliminary conversations about potential future opportunities," she said defensively. "No commitments were made." Marcus Thompson produced a second portfolio containing copies of email exchanges, meeting schedules, and preliminary licensing agreements that documented months of detailed negotiations between Margaret Parker and Meridian representatives. "Dr. Parker," Marcus said formally, "these communications suggest negotiations that go far beyond preliminary discussions about potential opportunities." The email exchanges revealed planning sessions, financial projections, and intellectual property valuations that indicated Margaret had been preparing to license Parker family research to Meridian for exclusive commercial development. The negotiations had progressed to draft contracts that would have given Meridian control over treatments developed with Miller Foundation funding, potentially restricting public access to life-saving medical advances. Furthermore, Marcus continued consulting legal briefs that outlined Foundation policies. These licensing discussions violate specific grant terms that require Foundation approval for any commercial development of research funded by charitable donations. Richard Parker examined the email evidence with growing dismay, recognizing that his mother's commercial negotiations had jeopardized not only their Foundation funding but potentially their entire academic careers. "Mother," he said quietly, "you didn't tell us about these licensing discussions. We had no idea you were negotiating with pharmaceutical companies." "I was protecting our family's research interests," Margaret replied, though her defensive tone suggested she understood that her unilateral negotiations had created problems that extended far beyond family dynamics. Meridian offered substantial financial support for expanded research if we could guarantee exclusive access to our discoveries. "Using Foundation-funded research," I interjected, my voice carrying the authority of someone whose charitable investments had been exploited for private gain. "Dr. Parker, you've been negotiating to sell exclusive rights to medical advances that were developed with Miller Foundation grants specifically intended to ensure public benefit rather than private profit." The distinction was crucial for understanding the ethical violations that went beyond simple grant noncompliance. The Miller Foundation had invested in Parker family research specifically to advance public health through accessible medical treatments. But Margaret's licensing negotiations would have transferred that publicly funded research to a private corporation known for restricting access through high pricing and exclusive patents. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward with university security personnel who'd been standing discreetly near the auditorium exits throughout the evening's confrontation. "Dr. Parker," Elena announced formally, "effective immediately, the university is suspending your administrative authority pending a complete investigation of research compliance and commercial licensing activities." Margaret's face showed shock at the speed with which her academic career was unraveling. "You can't suspend me without faculty review and due process," she protested. "I have tenure and administrative contracts that protect my position." "Tenure protects academic freedom," Elena replied calmly. "But it doesn't protect against research misconduct or violations of grant agreements that could jeopardize the university's relationship with major funding sources." University security approached Margaret with the professional courtesy due to a senior faculty member, while making clear that her access to laboratory facilities and administrative systems would be immediately restricted pending investigation outcomes. The woman who'd entered the evening as department chair was leaving as a suspended administrator facing potential criminal charges for grant fraud. Victoria Parker watched her mother-in-law's removal with growing panic about her own involvement in research coordination that had apparently violated Foundation requirements. "I wasn't involved in the licensing negotiations," Victoria said desperately. "My coordination with Richard's project was just efficient resource sharing between related research areas." Marcus Thompson consulted documentation that detailed Victoria's role in coordinating personnel, equipment, and data across multiple Foundation grants. "Dr. Parker," he said formally, "the Miller Foundation has evidence that you facilitated resource sharing that should have been disclosed to Foundation review boards. While your activities may not have involved commercial licensing, they did violate grant terms that require transparency about research coordination." The distinction offered Victoria some protection from the most serious charges facing Margaret, but her undisclosed coordination still represented grant violations that could result in funding suspension and professional sanctions. The ambitious researcher who'd built her career through strategic thinking had made calculations that assumed Foundation oversight was inadequate to detect coordination between related grants. James remained silent throughout the discussions of his family's research violations. His attention focused on processing the personal betrayal that had shattered his understanding of our marriage. "Kate," he said finally, "I need to understand why you hid this from me. If you're really Dr. Catherine Miller, if you really have all these credentials in this Foundation, why did you pretend to be someone else?" The question deserved an honest answer, though I suspected James wouldn't appreciate the truth about how his behavior had encouraged my deception. "James," I said carefully, "I hid my identity because you and your family made it clear that you preferred me as a supportive spouse, rather than a professional equal. Every time I tried to engage with your research intellectually, You redirected the conversation to safer topics that didn't challenge your role as the family's scientific expert. But I love you, James protested, his voice showing genuine confusion about how love could coexist with the systematic deception I'd maintained throughout our marriage. I wanted to protect you from the stress and competition of academic careers. I thought I was being considerate. You were being condescending, I corrected gently. James, you never asked about my educational background because you assumed it wasn't relevant. You never inquired about my professional interests because you believed I didn't have any. You never wondered how someone with family money could afford to support your research career because you were comfortable with the fiction that I was just a wealthy socialite. Marcus Thompson approached with final documentation that would determine the immediate consequences for the Parker family's research activities. Dr. Miller, he said formally, the Foundation's Board of Directors has authorized me to implement immediate remediation measures for grant violations. I nodded, understanding that the Foundation's response to Parker family misconduct would establish precedents for addressing similar violations by other grant recipients. What are the board's recommendations? I asked, though I'd participated in developing the remediation strategy during emergency foundation meetings over the past several weeks. All Parker family grants are suspended immediately pending complete audit of research activities and commercial discussions, Marcus announced, consulting legal documents that outlined Foundation policies for addressing grant violations. Dr. Margaret Parker's grants are terminated permanently due to undisclosed commercial licensing negotiations that violated Foundation mission requirements. The financial implications were devastating for Parker family research. The immediate suspension of $8.7 million in Foundation funding would halt their current projects, force layoffs of research personnel, and potentially end clinical trials that were showing promising results for treating genetic disorders. Richard and Victoria Parker's grants may be reinstated following complete disclosure of coordination activities and implementation of enhanced oversight procedures, Marcus continued. James Parker's gene therapy research will be reviewed independently since he appears to have been unaware of family coordination and commercial discussions. The distinction recognized that James had been manipulated by his family rather than actively participating in grant violations, though his ignorance of their activities raised questions about his leadership capabilities and attention to collaborative relationships that should have been obvious to someone working closely with family members. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward to address the immediate administrative consequences for Whitmore University's handling of the compliance violations. The university will implement enhanced oversight procedures for all Foundation grants, she announced, and will be conducting comprehensive review of research coordination policies to prevent similar violations in the future. The university's response reflected understanding that institutional changes were necessary to rebuild trust with major funding sources while protecting Whitmore's reputation for research integrity. Elena's leadership during the crisis would be crucial for maintaining relationships with other philanthropic organizations that might question the university's oversight capabilities. James looked around the nearly empty auditorium, taking in the scattered presentation materials, overturned furniture, and legal documents that represented the complete destruction of his family's research empire and his understanding of our marriage. Kate, he said quietly, what happens to us now? The question encapsulated the personal consequences of revelations that had exposed years of mutual deception and fundamental misunderstanding about our relationship. James was asking whether our marriage could survive the truth about my identity and his family's exploitation of my charitable funding. That depends, I replied honestly, on whether you can accept being married to someone more successful than you are, and whether I can forgive 6 years of being treated as intellectually inferior by someone who was unknowingly dependent on my support. James processed my response with the careful consideration he brought to complex research problems. Recognizing that our relationship would require complete reconstruction based on honest acknowledgement of my actual identity and capabilities. I want to try, he said finally. I want to understand how I was so wrong about who you are. Marcus Thompson began organizing his documentation as university security completed their escort of Margaret Parker from the auditorium. The legal and administrative consequences of the evening's revelations now set in motion through institutional channels that would determine long-term outcomes for everyone involved. Dr. Miller, Marcus said formally, The Foundation's response to this situation will be closely watched by other philanthropic organizations and research institutions. Your handling of these compliance violations will establish precedents for addressing similar issues in the future. I nodded, understanding that my transition from anonymous benefactor to public foundation leader carried responsibilities that extended far beyond the Parker family's specific violations. The Miller Foundation's reputation for research integrity would influence other charitable organizations' willingness to support academic research through similar funding mechanisms. The Foundation will implement enhanced oversight procedures for all grants, I announced, addressing the remaining university administrators who would be responsible for rebuilding institutional relationships with major funding sources. Will require quarterly compliance reports, independent audits of research coordination, and complete disclosure of any commercial discussions involving Foundation-funded research. Elena Rodriguez expressed appreciation for the Foundation's continued commitment to supporting Whitmore's research mission, despite the compliance violations that had damaged institutional trust. Dr. Miller, she said formally, the university looks forward to rebuilding our partnership based on enhanced transparency and shared commitment to research integrity. As the evening's participants began leaving the auditorium, I remained with James to begin the difficult conversations that would determine whether our marriage could survive the truth about my identity and his family's exploitation of my foundation. The woman who'd spent 6 years hiding her pharmaceutical empire while pretending to be an intellectually insignificant faculty wife was finally free to live authentically, but that freedom would require rebuilding every relationship based on honest acknowledgement of who I really was. The anonymous benefactor had become permanently visible. The Parker family's research empire had collapsed under the weight of their own misconduct, and the marriage that had been built on mutual deception would either be reconstructed through genuine partnership or dissolved through irreconcilable differences about power, respect, and intellectual equality. The foundation that had operated in secrecy would now demand accountability from all grant recipients. The university would implement oversight procedures that protected both institutional integrity and philanthropic relationships, and the woman who'd been dismissed as academically irrelevant had established herself as one of medical research's most influential leaders. James and I walked out of the auditorium together, beginning conversations that would determine whether our relationship could evolve from condescending protection to genuine partnership, while the consequences of the evening's revelations continued reshaping academic careers, institutional policies, and philanthropic relationships throughout the medical research community. The woman who'd built an empire while hiding behind a facade of helplessness had finally revealed her true capabilities, and everyone who'd underestimated her was discovering exactly what it meant to exploit the trust of someone far more powerful than they'd ever imagined. 2 years after the spring symposium that changed everything, I stood in my corner office at Miller Foundation headquarters, watching Boston Harbor sparkle in the morning sunlight. The woman reflected in those floor-to-ceiling windows bore no resemblance to the person who'd once hidden her pharmaceutical empire while pretending to be James's intellectually insignificant wife. Margaret Parker had been permanently banned from receiving any research funding, her academic career ending in disgrace after her undisclosed commercial negotiations were exposed. Richard and Victoria had completed remedial compliance training and were slowly rebuilding their reputations under strict oversight. Their research privileges had been restored, but they would carry the consequences of their coordination violations for years to come. James and I had rebuilt our marriage on entirely new foundations of honesty and mutual respect. He'd learned to appreciate being partnered with someone whose expertise complemented rather than threatened his own work. His gene therapy research was now thriving under complete transparency, and he'd become an advocate for ethical research practices throughout the academic community. The Miller Foundation had grown into one of the world's most influential medical research organizations, supporting breakthrough discoveries at 47 institutions across 6 continents. Our emphasis on transparency and accountability had elevated standards throughout the scientific community, proving that rigorous oversight enhanced rather than constrained innovation. The anonymous benefactor had become permanently visible, transforming from someone who hid her capabilities into a leader whose resources and expertise were advancing humanitarian goals that transcended individual interests. The Foundation's work was saving lives, training the next generation of researchers, and ensuring that medical breakthroughs served global public health rather than simply advancing institutional prestige or corporate profits. Standing in that office, reviewing quarterly reports that documented research successes built on strategic philanthropy and ethical collaboration, I realized that authentic achievement required authentic living. The woman who'd been dismissed as a research thief at a university gala had emerged as someone whose understanding of both science and business was changing how medical research was funded and conducted worldwide. The revelation of my true identity at that symposium had ended years of exhausting performance, while beginning a period of genuine accomplishment that exceeded anything I'd achieved while operating in secrecy. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying those who underestimate you, but becoming so authentically successful that their betrayal becomes irrelevant to your happiness. The Parker family had learned that trust, once broken, carried consequences that lasted far beyond immediate punishment. The university had implemented oversight procedures that were now being adopted by institutions worldwide. The foundation had established new standards for philanthropic accountability that protected both charitable mission and research integrity. Most importantly, I discovered that hiding extraordinary capabilities to make others comfortable was a betrayal of both personal potential and the people whose lives could be improved through strategic use of resources and expertise. The medical breakthroughs enabled by foundation funding were reaching patients who desperately needed innovative treatments, proving that authentic leadership could create impact impossible to achieve through anonymous giving. James arrived at my office for our daily briefing on collaborative research projects, his enthusiasm for our partnership reflecting complete transformation from the man who'd once explained basic scientific concepts to his wife as if she were an interested amateur. Our relationship now exemplified what became possible when successful people supported rather than competed with each other's achievements. The spring symposium, where I'd been accused of research theft, had become the launching point for a career that was advancing medical science while inspiring countless women to embrace their capabilities without apology. The foundation's success demonstrated that combining generous funding with rigorous oversight could accelerate scientific discovery while maintaining ethical standards that protected humanitarian mission. The woman who'd spent years hiding her pharmaceutical empire while pretending to be powerless had learned that real success meant using every resource and capability to advance goals larger than personal comfort or social acceptance. The research that had once been funded anonymously was now supported through visible partnerships that created accountability, transparency, and strategic coordination impossible to achieve through hidden giving. Today, the Miller Foundation continues expanding its global impact, supporting research that prioritizes accessible treatments for the world's most urgent health challenges. The approach we pioneered, combining generous funding with ethical oversight, has been adopted by philanthropic organizations worldwide, proving that charitable giving can maintain both humanitarian mission and scientific rigor. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.